once again, veering wildly in a different direction. If Dead Kid Dance had no chart presence in America, this next gentleman, John Cougar Mellencamp, and it is the John Cougar Mellencamp version of this gentleman, as opposed to the John Mellencamp or the John Cougar version of his brand.
Yep.
John Cougar Mellencamp-SCARECROW. This one sold a lot of albums, guys. I am going to pull it up right now in terms of doing a little bit of a bio. But before I do that, I'll kind of change up the format a little bit and how we're doing these albums. Sort of Sam alluded to his relationship with John Cougar Mellencamp, which was sort of like a begrudging, like, I'm aware of him and I don't know how I feel about covering this album. We'll revisit that again. But Josh, what is your relationship with John Cougar Mellencamp?
Oh, just like Jack and Diane and probably ROCK in the USA from this album, and just the fact that he always got compared to like Bruce Springsteen, which I will speak about in my review, I think, and almost in this kind of stereotype of like him representing middle America, and the wasn't he involved in kind of the fundraiser for like Farm Aid or something?
He's one of the founding members of the Farm Aid group.
Yeah,
yes.
So that is the extent of my Mellencamp knowledge.
Well, so Mellencamp he is from Middle America. He was born in Seymour, Indiana, October 7th, 1951. I thought, interestingly enough, he was born with spina bifida, which he had corrective surgery for as an infant, which was not something I would have thought. You know what I mean? It doesn't present, and I know that can run from significant to mild. And he actually forms his first band at the age of 14. It's called Crepe Soul, which is an interesting band. Wikipedia does a great job of like very hilariously condensing his life. I have different sources, but in this one it says Mellencamp attended Vincennes, Vincennes, Is that, am I correct with that, Josh? Did I get?
Yes. Yep. Vincennes, okay. I think.
Vincennes University in Vincennes, Indiana, starting in 1972. And then Wikipedia immediately transitions to, during this time, he abused drugs and alcohol, which I thought, okay, he was there, but that's all we're going to get, right? So I think more importantly, he played in a bunch of bands when he was in college, including a glam rock band called Trash, which was actually named for a New York Dolls song. I had a hard time imagining John Mellencamp playing glam rock, guys, but the next thing, though, I can absolutely think, which is that he later got a job in Seymour, Indiana, installing telephones, which definitely does sound like something that John Mellencamp would have done there. He gives up drugs and alcohol before graduating from college, so good for him for getting on that train nice and early, before his rock star career, which is, I think, fascinating. And he decides to go to New York City in an attempt to land a contract, which I always love when a guy's just like, you know what, I'm just going to go to New York and see if I can, get a record contract. It doesn't seem, right, like that there's a lot that would indicate
really bold.
that he was going to get this, right? But it says, a lot of the research I say is he spent like a period of a couple years traveling back and forth between Indiana and New York City. This is like 1974 to 1975, so that can't have been easy in that era. And he eventually ends up with meeting a gentleman by the name of Tony DeFries, who is digging his scene, so to speak. And he ends up releasing an album called The Chestnut Street Incident, which is a collection of covers and a couple original songs. And at this point, he was Johnny Cougar. And because the record company thought that Mellencamp was too hard to market. That was what it was. So they said Johnny Cougar instead. He ends up doing an album called The Kick Inside in 1977. And he ends up getting dropped from his record label.
Isn't that a Kate Bush song? The Kick Inside?
Yeah, that's The Kick Inside. This is The Kid Inside.
Oh, okay. Misheard.
Not to be confused, and I'm sure not to be confused sonically with The Kick Inside either. Right. So he gets dropped from there, and it's funny because they end up not releasing the album in 1977, but it does end up getting released in early 1983 after Mellencamp kind of begins to get big. So they've decided at that point it's okay to release. So after he gets dropped by MCA, Rod Stewart's manager decides that he is going to sign him to the Riva Records label. And Rod Stewart's manager asked him to move to London for a year to record and promote and tour for 1978's A Biography album. And he ends up getting a top 5 hit in Australia with a song called I Need a Lover. And then Riva Records decides to keep him, and he does 1979's John Cougar, which begins to break him a little bit more in Europe and the United States. And in 1980, he does Nothing Matters and What If It Did, and that is when he gets his first 2 top 40 singles, This Time and Ain't Even Done with the Night, which he is not a big fan of those 2 songs.
I'm not sure I know those by the title.
Pretty vocally. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with them, but it isn't until 1982 when Mellencamp starts releasing songs. I think you know he does American Fool in 1982, and that contains the lead single Hurt So Good, which I cannot think of anything but the NFL films things of guys getting just wrecked by safeties and dropped on their head with that in the background. So and then Jack and Diane is also on there. Hurt So Good goes on to win the Grammy for Best Male Rock Vocal Performance. John Cougar Mellencamp is also pretty vocal about that album, saying, to be real honest, there's 3 good songs on that record, and the rest is just sort of filler. It was too labored over, too thought about, and it wasn't organic enough. The record company thought it would bomb, but I think the reason it took off was, not that the songs were better than my others, but people liked the sound of it. The bam, bam, bam drums. It was a different sound than what was out. So he does that. In 1983, he records the album. The song that you probably would most know from that is the song Pink Houses, which was a top 10 hit. Definitely know that one. And then he goes on tour in 1984. And I think it's interesting. Around this time, he's beginning to cultivate the image we know of. And, you know, we think of 1984, right? And I know you're going to mention it, Josh. And we've got another noted Springsteen aficionado, Sam, on the podcast. That's also when Born in the USA is out. And that leads us to 1985 Scarecrow, which has the following top 40 singles: Lonely Old Night and Small Town, which both get to number 6, ROCK in the USA, which gets to number 2, Rain on the Scarecrow, which gets to number 21, and Rumble Seat, which gets to number 28. And Mellencamp is more of a fan of this album than he is of others, and for I think a variety of reasons, some of which is he had more control over it. And he thinks that the lyrics were more representative of sort of like his own je ne sais quoi, if you will. And shortly after this, he does help organize the Farm Aid benefit concerts with Willie Nelson and Neil Young as well, which as of 2023 have raised over $60 million for family farmers. So good on him for that. Okay. I think I was supposed to take the first take, but I've talked a lot right there, and I'll kind of jump in. Why don't we just go ahead to you, Sam, and Josh, and have you take the first take. Sam can come in second, then I'll jump in at the end.
Sure, sounds good. So I was real pleasantly surprised with this album, and my first question is, would this album even be made today? Like, would this album even be popular today? I feel like in some ways it's kind of very provocative and
lyrically, you think?
Yeah, politically kind of confrontational. It's very questioning of the politics of our nation at that time in the 80s, and I feel like this album would be so polarizing today, and I can't think of any artist in this day and age, country or otherwise, that would write lyrics like this and write something that would just say like, what is going on with this country, what are we doing, and not like kind of taking a side one way or another.
It's funny you say that, Josh, because Small Town is kind of like the glory days of John Cougar Mellencamp, right? Where you can hear people singing it and thinking he's celebrating it, but you're like, is he? Or is he kind of like knocking it? Because, it's, people say it glory days, but it's like, that's kind of actually a pathetic lead character, right? And like Small Town, it's like, I was born and raised, and people are like, yeah, I was born and raised. And it's like, he's not necessarily saying that's a good thing all the time too. So I hear you on that one.
Yeah, I think, and I think the comparison to Springsteen is kind of really only surface level. If you listen to their music, as we have done, then you kind of know that Springsteen is very much a storyteller and rooted in nostalgia, or like kind of a fake nostalgia in a lot of his stories. And this seems very grounded in reality and very either current facing or forward facing in terms of, we need to, what are we thinking? Like, what are we doing as a nation? Like, why are we acting this way? And that's sprinkled in with like something like Rain on the Scarecrow, which is the kind of the opening track, which is surprisingly dark, but I really like dark in sound and kind of theme, but I also really like
it's about a failed family farmer. It's
right.
Kind of what the narrative is.
Yeah, but the sound, the rock sound that he kind of incorporates throughout the entire album is really fun to listen to. And I guess kind of that's where the other, sonically, there could be comparisons to how he sounds to Springsteen, but I think that's ultimately where the comparisons end in my mind based on this album. It's, when you write a song like ROCK in the USA, people are going to take that one, they're going to take that song and not incorporate or factor in the rest of the album and what he's trying to say on this. And so I think I really enjoyed this album overall, not just for kind of what it was saying lyrically, but the rock sound that he has, this kind of like heartland, almost roots rock, Americana type of sound, very guitar based and incorporating the harmonica and the fiddle at times. I feel like the drums have a very kind of like basic but grounding sound to them. It's kind of got a toe tapping beat to it in a lot of the songs. And the I think just the lyrical content is kind of unique to what we heard. The fact that he's talking about farmers and talking about this idea. And I think the other thing to point out would be like, this doesn't exist in rock anymore. I think this idea of small town life and getting by and pulling yourself by your bootstraps has been completely like appropriated and subsumed into country music and modern country music. And that is,
I agree, Josh.
I think that's for the worse in some ways, because this is very appealing to me to listen to, whereas most modern country I do not listen to. And something has gone away or missing. I don't know if it will come back from where this was in 85 to where music, where it's, I guess what I'm trying to say is what these themes are and how they're incorporated into rock music versus how they are in country music, and just kind of the split or the disappearance of even trying something like this. So I was really, and the other thing I would say is that all of the songs, I didn't really like the singles. I think they're kind of the weakest part, or the kind of the surface level stuff of this album. And I really liked everything else more that was around it. Maybe like Lonely Old Night I kind of liked the best of the singles, but all the other songs I found much more interesting and fun to listen to. So yeah, this was a real pleasant surprise. It was kind of thought-provoking on a level I wasn't expecting. I'm glad we ended up listening to it. It's been another pleasant surprise on our random pick type of show. But I'm interested to hear what you guys kind of think about this one.
Okay, Sam, you got the next take.
No, I'm glad you brought up the idea of kind of that Springsteen Mellencamp comparison, because I was like a lot of pretty much what you said is a lot of the same ideas I'm gonna echo there. Of like musically, it was toe tapping. You can get into it. It's solid musically. Lyrics though is for some of the songs they really do move into that realm of where Springsteen kind of focused on like narratives and creating these fictionalized blue collar characters, right? And telling these stories that he never really lived. Mellencamp is telling the perspective of flyover country and really kind of highlighting like, hey, for this, like, not to pull from the title, but small town, right? This is small town.
We should mention
country.
You're from flyover country,
pretty much.
So it's not
and
necessarily
so, like,
said with like a
this pulls from that perspective where Springsteen and Patti Seeger, right? You have those singer-songwriter guys that kind of like moved in a different realm. He kind of pulled more towards the Woody Guthrie. Who's the other? Like the Woody Guthrie, early Dylan, right?
That's a
like
good point.
that genre to kind of like pull into it, say like, oh, here's something like you're forgetting. And like for me, it was, even though it might have been just like this, listening through the Apple music, the small town acoustic version. I don't know if you guys have that version in the album feed that you listened to.
I did. I did listen to it out of curiosity.
I thought that one did a really nice job of grounding and stripping away the sound to focus more on the lyrics, which you can see, like, lyrically, like, there are that Americana feel of singer-songwriters today that do kind of, like, pull in that same, Woody Guthrie vein and, Johnny Cash, like, the storytellers, but grounded into, like, talking about real people's pains. Or, like, for me, the best song was Rain on a Scarecrow. I thought that was just, like, the best song overall, musically, lyrically. It kind of like hit it. There are some songs that just kind of like, like the Grandma's Theme. I thought that was a throwaway tune that they didn't even need to include on the album. And then there were, I think it was like, Between a Laugh and a Tear. I thought that was kind of incomplete lyrically. It just didn't really go anywhere for me. Whereas like Justice and Independence, 85, Face of a Nation, like you could tell he's kind of singing about like, yeah, Reagan economics sucks. This is what it's doing. And so, I think there were some really neat songs that kind of like moved into that political spectrum.
Yep. Yeah, it's a really good point that you made about him being more like Woody Guthrie and those kind of early folk singers striving or, speaking for the working class and collective bargaining or whatever, rights or whatever, those types of themes. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
what about you, John?
I guess it's my time to jump in. I would echo you, Josh, in the sense that I don't know if I've given John Mellencamp as much credit as I should have for his lyrical content. I actually think, if we go all the way with the Springsteen analogy, I actually think he lyrically does Springsteen better than Springsteen. I actually felt more conviction and personal connection. He doesn't do the thing that like Dylan and Springsteen does where he keeps the detachment, right, with the parables and the stories. You get the feeling he's writing about specific people and he's not talking around it. And a lot of times, like, sometimes it seems like he's right. Like Small Town seems like he's writing about himself. I mean, he even mentions like married an LA woman, brought her back to this. I'm like, well, that's, I think, his narrative, right, along the way. And I've always liked that song, Small Town. I've always hated the song ROCK in the USA, and this album did not change my idea. I look at that as a lot of these singers in this era, they have a real love of like 50s and early 60s rock and roll, right? And a lot of their music is grounded in that, as well as the folk tradition, as well as roots rock and classic rock and roll. A lot of these things thrown together, right? They would probably say R&B, and he's no different than any number of male singer-songwriters that we've covered. Springsteen, Seeger, all of these people who have that attachment. And I don't think his image is as calculated as maybe I would have thought when I was younger. I think to some degree his image got appropriated, much to his chagrin. I feel like he was an unwilling participant, and the bio seems to line up with that. I know politically I think who he was marketed to and who he ended up feeling he represented were two very different things. Springsteen, I think, appealed more across it, but I think this idea of Springsteen as a progressive icon is more when people found out he agreed with them on their politics, as opposed to a natural disposition to liking his music. I think if you put truth serum in a lot of people who claim to love Springsteen now in the 80s and 90s, I wonder how many of them were with it, right? In the Born in the
Right.
USA and Streets of Philadelphia, all the way through that era, right? I think it's sort of like convenient. And I think Mellencamp's another one of these that he probably lost some fans when people figured out he wasn't, in their mind, right, the small town scribe that they thought he was. So it's kind of like the reverse almost, right? But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by the lyrical content. I will say sonically, I want a little bit more in this. It is a little bit by the book rock and roll.
Yeah.
And I think John Cougar Mellencamp's voice is pleasant. And I'll give you an example. Like, I remember he did a cover of Wild Night with Michel Ndegeocello in the 90s, which I thought was like a fantastic cover of that Van Morrison song. It's like, I think it's just like a top tier cover ever. If you've never heard it, it's well worth checking out. If for no other reason than Michel Ndegeocello is awesome. But yeah, so I've heard different stuff I like. I do, like I said, I like Small Town. I think Hurts So Good has a soft spot in me. I wouldn't necessarily say I think it's good, but I don't mind it either. And so his voice is there, but there isn't a lot of variety in terms of the way he sings and the presentation. So as a result, like, kind of once you get to the end of 10 to 12 songs, you're about ready, right? And in that way, I think that's why he's such a singles act, because of the fact that I don't know if people hear a John Mellencamp. I shouldn't say they should, because he sold a ton of albums. There probably are a lot of people, I think, but at a certain level, if you're used to a certain level of sophistication, you'd be looking for more, and maybe he represents sort of a gateway drug to like other music that you'd be listening to. And so for that, I think sonically, I can't move it beyond the thumbs in the middle for me, just because I think musically and heft-wise, it doesn't rise to that level for me. And while I did like the lyrics, and I really liked some of the lyrics, especially earlier in the album. I do think toward the end it got a little bit more, a little more ROCK in the USA in terms of themes, right? And
it's a little on the nose at the time, I would say.
A little on the nose at the time is a good way to put it, Josh. Like whereas at the beginning there's a little bit more, well, compared to that,
nuance.
A little bit more nuance. I wouldn't say this album was nuanced in the sense, and I think that's an attribute for it, right? That he doesn't write with nuance, and that's okay, because some of the things he's talking about don't need nuance. If you're a failing farmer, like, nuance just seems almost overly intellectual, right? Like, you don't need to have a lot of nuance to understand, like, we were making a living and now we're not anymore. So I appreciate that element of it. And yeah, so I would say for me, thumbs in the middle. What about you guys?
Yeah, I'm going to give it a slight thumbs up. I enjoyed it. I think it was thought-provoking and just kind of a pleasant surprise. So I think I liked it more than when we listened to that Bob Seger album back in the day, if we're going to compare something like that. Sam, I'm interested, do you remember growing up, like, having John Cougar Mellencamp? Was that, like, around a lot, or, like, in the musical atmosphere?
He wasn't on my radar at all. Okay. Like, besides the pop songs, right? Like, which you heard, like, that wasn't something that was there. And it was something that, he would occasionally pop on the music radar, as John said, with, like, the Wild Nights cover. Really good. That caught my ear. I was like, this is good. But then the rest of it, I was just like, meh. Like, the hits, you could understand why they were hits musically. Like, hey, a lot of people are going to dig this because it's just something that's pleasing to the ear. Yeah. But at the same time, it's just, like John was saying, musically, it just never really captured me. Lyrically, you go like, okay, giving it like a second and third listen to, just to kind of really make sure I was, being able to base my opinion on something more tangible. Lyrically, there were some very solid songs, some very good songs, But like John said, it's not like, nuance wasn't really there, which is fine. At the same time, musically, just didn't really do too much. That's why Rain on the Scarecrow might have been the best song for me, besides a stripped down Small Town.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the rest of it was just kind of like this, okay, not for me, but I can get how some people are into it.
Yeah. Maybe that's where the Bruce Springsteen kind of rises in estimation too, because his music is a bit more lyrically complex, especially, or not lyrically complex, musically complex, especially with like the E Street Band and all of that too.
Yep. But yeah, I definitely I was not disappointed in this album. If anything, my level of esteem for John Cougar Mellencamp, probably he'd want you to go John Mellencamp, right? The Cougar sort of seemed to be, yeah. So I'll go John Mellencamp on this. Probably rose a little bit for sure.